The secret war tactics of the Vikings that terrified Europe. You wake up to the sound of something unfamiliar. Not the wind, not the bells, something sharper. Wood striking against wood, then shouting. Not in your language, not in any language you recognize. You step outside, and the world you knew only moments ago is already gone. The horizon is filled with long, narrow ships cutting through the morning mist. They move faster than anything you have ever seen, gliding toward the shore with a precision that feels unnatural. There is no formation, no warning, no time to gather men or send word to nearby towns. They are already here. By the time the first alarm spreads, the attack has begun. Doors are broken, fires are lit. Sacred places are no longer protected. Men who have never held a weapon are forced to run or fall. And those who try to stand and fight quickly realize something terrifying. This is not a battle. This is something else. These warriors do not wait. They do not challenge. They do not offer you the chance to prepare. They strike with purpose, take what they want, and disappear before any organized resistance can form. What remains is not just destruction. It is confusion. Because how do you defend against something that does not follow the rules? This was the moment Europe changed forever. Not because of the scale of the violence, but because of the realization that the old ways of war no longer applied. The enemy did not behave like an enemy. They moved like a force of nature, sudden, unpredictable, impossible to contain, and that was only the beginning. Because what made the Vikings truly terrifying was not just how they fought, it was how they made an entire continent feel exposed before the fight even began. They did not fight like anyone else. To understand why Europe was unprepared, you need to understand how war was supposed to work. Kings gathered armies slowly. Messengers rode for days, sometimes weeks, calling men to arms. Battles were announced, expected, almost ritualistic. Two forces would meet on open ground, facing each other with banners raised, each side knowing where and when the fight would begin. There was structure, there were rules, and those rules created a dangerous illusion. Because when war follows a pattern, it becomes predictable. And when it becomes predictable, it can be controlled. The Vikings saw that weakness immediately. They did not send warnings. They did not wait for armies to gather. They did not seek open fields or fair fights. They chose targets that could not defend themselves in time. Coastal villages, isolated monasteries, trade hubs that relied on peace to function. They attacked where resistance was weakest and confusion was strongest. Imagine preparing for a storm that is supposed to arrive in one place, at one time, with signs you can recognize. Now imagine that storm ignoring every rule, appearing without warning, striking multiple locations, and vanishing before you can even understand what happened. That is what the Vikings became. Not an army, a disruption. European leaders struggled to respond because their entire system depended on time. Time to gather forces, time to plan, time to react. The Vikings removed that time completely. By the moment the threat was understood, the damage was already done. And this created something far more powerful than physical destruction. It created paralysis. Because how do you defend a coastline that stretches for thousands of miles? How do you protect every village, every river, every point of entry at once? The answer was simple. You could not. And once that realization spread, fear followed it. Not fear of defeat in battle, but fear of never seeing the battle coming at all. The longships changed everything. If the Vikings were the storm, their ships were the reason no one could escape it. At first glance, they did not look like instruments of domination. Long, narrow, almost fragile. Nothing like the heavy vessels used by kingdoms for trade or war. But that was the deception, because these ships were not built to impress. They were built to move. The Viking longship could cross open seas and, within hours, slip into shallow rivers that no enemy vessel could follow. It could land on a beach without a harbor, unload warriors in seconds, and vanish just as quickly. There was no need for ports, no need for established routes, no need for permission. Every coastline became an entry point. Every river became a road. And suddenly, nowhere felt safe. Imagine living miles inland, far from the sea, believing distance protects you. Then one morning, ships appear not on the horizon, but in the river that runs through your land. Warriors stepping onto your soil from a direction you never considered vulnerable. That was the moment the illusion of safety collapsed. The longship did more than transport warriors. It erased geography as a defense. Natural barriers that once defined security no longer mattered. The Vikings could reach places armies were never meant to reach, strike, and leave before any response could form. But there was something even more unsettling: speed. These attacks were not slow invasions. They were precise, fast, and calculated. By the time word traveled from one town to another, the Vikings were already gone, sometimes appearing again somewhere else, repeating the cycle. It created a feeling that they were everywhere, not because they were, but because they could be. And that possibility was enough. Because once people realized that no distance, no river, no coastline could protect them, fear stopped being local. It became constant. They attacked the mind first. Before the Vikings destroyed cities, they destroyed certainty. Because the true battlefield was not the land, it was the mind. Their choice of targets was never random. They struck places that carried meaning: monasteries, sacred grounds, centers of faith where people believed they were protected not by walls, but by something higher. These were not just locations, they were symbols of order, stability, and divine protection. And the Vikings shattered that illusion without hesitation. When the first raids reached places like Lindisfarne, the shock was deeper than the violence itself. Monks who had never known war were suddenly facing it. Sacred relics were taken. Churches were burned. And nothing stopped it. No divine intervention, no miracle, no warning. That was the message. If even the most protected places could fall, then nowhere was safe. This was not just destruction. It was psychological precision. The stories spread faster than the ships. Survivors carried them inland. Traders whispered them across regions. Entire communities began to imagine attacks before they ever happened. And imagination, once infected by fear, does the work of an army. Villages prepared for something they could not predict. Kings feared enemies they could not track. The idea of the Vikings became larger than their actual presence. And that was the turning point. Because once fear takes hold of the mind, it no longer needs constant reinforcement. It sustains itself. Every distant sail becomes a threat. Every unfamiliar sound becomes a warning. Every silence becomes suspicious. The Vikings understood this without needing to explain it. They did not just arrive with weapons. They arrived with a reputation that weakened their enemies before the first strike. And from that moment on, Europe was not just defending against raids, it was defending against the possibility of them. War without battlefields. What made the Vikings so dangerous was not just how they attacked, it was how they refused to stay. In the world Europe understood, war had a rhythm. Armies gathered, advanced, and met in decisive battles. Victory or defeat would be determined in a single moment of confrontation. Even in loss, there was clarity. You knew where the enemy was. You knew when the fighting would begin. The Vikings removed that certainty completely. They did not seek decisive battles. They avoided them. Instead, they struck quickly, took what they needed, and disappeared before any organized force could respond. By the time a king assembled his army, the Vikings were already gone, leaving behind only smoke, silence, and confusion. And then, without warning, they would return. Not to the same place, not in the same way, somewhere else. This created a new kind of war. One without a front line, without a clear enemy position, without a predictable pattern. A war where the question was not where to fight, but where the next attack would come from. Imagine trying to defend an entire coastline, every river, every settlement, knowing that the enemy could appear anywhere, at any time. not to conquer immediately, but to destabilize, to weaken, to remind you that you are always exposed. That is not a battle. That is pressure. Constant, invisible pressure that wears down confidence, drains resources, and forces leaders into impossible decisions. Do you defend everything and spread your forces thin, or defend nothing and risk losing everything? There was no correct answer, and that was the strategy. The Vikings turned war into a series of interruptions, short, violent, unpredictable moments that never allowed Europe to recover fully. Just enough time to rebuild, just enough time to believe the threat had passed, and then it would begin again. Because the true power of this tactic was not in the destruction itself. It was in the uncertainty it created, a world where peace no longer felt real, only temporary. They studied their enemies. The image of the Vikings as reckless raiders is powerful, but it is incomplete. Because behind every sudden attack, there was something far more deliberate at work. Observation. Long before the first strike, the Vikings were already watching. Traders, scouts, and travelers moved quietly through European lands, learning without being noticed. They mapped coastlines, understood river systems, identified wealthy targets, and paid close attention to patterns. When did guards change? Where were defenses weakest? Which settlements relied on routine instead of vigilance? They were not guessing. They were preparing. This is what made their attacks feel almost unnatural, not because they were random, but because they were precise. They did not waste energy on heavily fortified cities unless there was a clear advantage. They avoided strong resistance when it did not serve their purpose. Instead, they chose moments when their enemies were most vulnerable, and they adapted constantly. What worked in one region was adjusted in another. Tactics evolved based on experience. Each raid was not just an act of violence, but a source of information. What failed was corrected. What succeeded was repeated, refined, and made more effective. This is what turned them from raiders into something far more dangerous. They became students of their enemies. And once you understand your enemy deeply enough, you no longer need overwhelming force. You need timing. Because a well-timed strike against a predictable opponent can achieve more than a larger army ever could. The Vikings understood that Europe relied on routine, on expectation, on systems that functioned well under normal conditions. So they attacked the moments when those systems failed. And once those failures became visible, they did not just exploit them, they returned to them, again and again, until those weaknesses became impossible to ignore. They attacked what people believed was untouchable. There is a difference between destroying a place and breaking what it represents. The Vikings understood that difference. They did not begin by targeting the strongest fortresses or the most heavily defended cities. They chose something far more powerful. They chose belief. In a world where faith defined order, where protection was not only physical but spiritual, certain places were considered untouchable. Monasteries stood at the center of that belief. They were not built for war. They were built for devotion. Their walls were not meant to resist armies. Their purpose was sacred, and because of that, they were trusted to be safe. Untouched by violence, shielded by the idea that what was holy would remain protected. The Vikings shattered that idea without hesitation. When they struck these places, they were not just taking gold or destroying buildings. They were sending a message that went far beyond the physical damage. If the sacred could fall, then nothing was beyond reach. If divine protection did not intervene, then what else could people trust? This was not just fear, it was disorientation. Because once belief is shaken, everything built upon it begins to weaken. The certainty that guided decisions, the confidence that held communities together, the assumption that some boundaries would never be crossed, all of it began to collapse. And the Vikings did not need to explain this. The effect spoke for itself. Stories of these attacks spread quickly, not just as accounts of violence, but as evidence that something fundamental had changed. People no longer feared only the arrival of warriors. They feared the absence of protection. That shift was devastating. Because when people begin to question what they once believed was untouchable, they do not just prepare for defense. They begin to doubt everything. And in that doubt, the Vikings found one of their greatest advantages, not just the ability to destroy, but the ability to unsettle an entire civilization at its core. They stopped leaving. At first, the pattern was clear. They arrived, they struck, and they disappeared. That rhythm, as terrifying as it was, still allowed Europe to believe something important: that the Vikings did not belong, that they would always return to the north, that the threat, no matter how unpredictable, was temporary. Then something changed. They stopped leaving. What began as seasonal raids slowly turned into something more permanent. Viking groups started staying through the winter, establishing camps deep within enemy territory, not on the edges, not hidden along remote coasts, but inside the lands they once only attacked. This was a different kind of strategy, because staying meant control. It meant observing more closely, striking more efficiently, and adapting in real time. It meant that the Vikings were no longer outsiders appearing without warning. They were now a presence that could not be removed easily, operating within the very systems they once disrupted. And that changed everything. Because defending against an enemy that comes and goes is one thing. Defending against an enemy that is already inside your borders is something else entirely. Settlements began to form. Strongholds were established. Over time, what once looked like temporary encampments became footholds of influence. The Vikings were no longer just raiders. They were becoming settlers, negotiators, rulers in certain regions. And this created a new kind of fear. Not the fear of sudden attack, but the fear of gradual takeover, because now the question was no longer when they would return. It was how far they would expand. And once that question took hold, the idea of reclaiming control became far more difficult. The Vikings were no longer interrupting the system. They were becoming part of it. They exploited Europe's fragmentation. By the time Europe understood the threat, it was already divided. Not by geography, but by power. Kingdoms stood side by side, but not together. Rivalries ran deep. Alliances were fragile, often temporary, shaped by ambition rather than unity. Each ruler focused on protecting his own land, his own interests, his own survival. And the Vikings saw this clearly. They were not facing a single enemy. They were facing many. Instead of confronting Europe as a united force, they approached it as a collection of opportunities. If one kingdom was strong, they moved to another that was weaker. If a region was distracted by internal conflict, they struck there. If two rulers were at odds, they used that division to their advantage. This was not coincidence. It was strategy. Because a divided enemy does not need to be defeated all at once. It can be weakened piece by piece, each strike reinforcing the inability of others to respond effectively. While one region struggled to recover, another was already under attack. And coordination, which could have been Europe's greatest defense, became its greatest weakness. Imagine knowing that an enemy is moving across the land, yet being unable to rely on your neighbors for support. Messages take time. Decisions take longer. By the moment help arrives, the Vikings are gone, and the damage is already done. This created a cycle. Each attack exposed the inability to act as one. Each failure to respond reinforced the pattern. And over time, that pattern became predictable, not for Europe, but for the Vikings. They learned where resistance would be slow, where communication would fail, where power was fragmented enough to allow repeated strikes without consequence. And they returned to those places, not because they were the easiest targets, but because they were the most strategically valuable. Because in a divided world, you do not need overwhelming strength. You only need to understand where unity breaks. And once you find those fractures, you do not need to force them open. You simply press until they widen on their own. When the fear started to break. For years, the Vikings dictated the rhythm of fear. They chose when to appear. They chose where to strike. And Europe reacted, always one step behind, always trying to recover from something it never fully understood. But fear, even when powerful, is not permanent. It changes. Slowly at first, almost invisibly, something began to shift. Not in the Vikings, but in the way Europe responded to them. The shock that once paralyzed began to give way to adaptation. The same unpredictability that had once created confusion now forced a different kind of thinking. Leaders started to learn. Coastlines were no longer left exposed. Watch points were established. Signals were developed to warn of approaching ships. Towns that had once relied on distance for safety began to build defenses, not because they were strong, but because they could no longer afford to be unprepared. Walls rose where none had existed before, and more importantly, time began to shorten. The greatest advantage the Vikings had was speed, the gap between their arrival and Europe's response. But as systems improved, that gap began to close. Messages traveled faster. Armies mobilized more efficiently. The window of opportunity that once allowed raids to succeed without resistance started to narrow. And that changed the balance, not completely. The Vikings were still dangerous, still capable of striking with precision. But now, they were no longer facing a world that remained unchanged. They were facing one that had begun to adapt to them. And adaptation introduces something new: resistance. This was the first moment where the Vikings could no longer rely on the same level of unpredictability. Their enemies had started to expect them, to prepare, not perfectly, but enough to make certain attacks riskier, less certain, less controlled. The fear did not disappear, but it transformed. It became something more focused, less paralyzing, more strategic. A fear that pushed people to act rather than freeze. And once that shift occurs, the advantage begins to move. Because the greatest weapon the Vikings had was not just speed or strength, it was the psychological edge. And for the first time, that edge began to weaken. War would never be the same. By the time Europe began to understand what it was facing, something irreversible had already happened. War had changed, not in appearance, not in the weapons or the armor, but in its logic. The old idea of conflict, where power was measured by size, by strength, by the ability to gather the largest army and meet the enemy in open battle, had been exposed as incomplete. The Vikings had proven something different. That speed could defeat strength. That unpredictability could overcome preparation. That fear, carefully applied, could achieve what force alone could not. And once that lesson is learned, it cannot be forgotten. European rulers began to rethink everything. Defense was no longer about walls alone, but about awareness. Armies were no longer just forces to be assembled, but tools that needed to move faster, respond quicker, and adapt to changing conditions. The battlefield was no longer a place. It was a condition, something that could emerge anywhere, at any moment. This shift extended beyond the Viking Age. The principles they demonstrated, striking without warning, avoiding direct confrontation when unnecessary, using mobility and intelligence instead of sheer force, became part of how future conflicts would be fought, not always in the same form, but with the same logic. Because once you understand that control of time, movement, and perception can outweigh numbers, the entire structure of war begins to evolve. And that is the legacy they left behind. Not just burned villages or conquered lands, but a new way of thinking about conflict itself. A way that would echo through centuries, reshaping how enemies were faced, how battles were planned, and how victory was defined. The Vikings did not just fight wars, they redefined them. The real reason they were feared. At the beginning, It looked like violence, burned buildings, stolen wealth, sudden raids that left destruction behind. But that was never the true source of fear, because Europe had seen violence before. Kingdoms had fought wars for generations, armies had clashed, cities had fallen, and yet the structure of the world remained intact. There were rules, expectations, a sense that even in chaos, something held. The Vikings took that away. They did not just attack land, they attacked certainty. The certainty that distance meant safety, the certainty that faith meant protection, the certainty that war followed rules that could be understood and prepared for. One by one, those assumptions began to disappear. And once they were gone, something deeper took their place. A constant awareness that no place was truly secure, that any moment could become the moment everything changed. This is what made them unforgettable. Not just the speed of their ships or the precision of their attacks, but the feeling they left behind. A feeling that did not fade when they left, that did not disappear with time, that remained in the minds of those who survived. Because fear that comes from destruction can be rebuilt, but fear that comes from uncertainty stays. It lingers in decisions, in hesitation, in the way people see the world. It shapes how leaders act, how communities prepare, how entire regions respond to threats that may or may not come. And that is the kind of impact that lasts. The Vikings did not need to be everywhere. They only needed people to believe that they could be. And once that belief spread, their presence extended far beyond their numbers, far beyond their ships, into the very way Europe thought about danger, safety, and survival. That was their greatest weapon, and it is the reason they are still remembered not just as warriors, but as something far more unsettling, a force that changed how the world felt. Closing loop. You wake up to the sound of something unfamiliar. At the beginning, it was confusion, noise without meaning, a distant threat that did not yet have a shape. But now, after everything you have seen, that sound is no longer unknown. You recognize it. The rhythm of oars cutting through water, the sudden silence before impact, the realization that what is coming does not follow rules, does not wait, does not hesitate. And that is what changes everything. Because the Vikings were never just a force of destruction, they were a force of disruption. They entered a world built on predictability and showed with precision that predictability could be broken. Not everywhere at once, but in enough places, in enough moments, to make certainty feel fragile. And once certainty becomes fragile, it is never the same again. Europe did not just suffer attacks. It was forced to evolve, forced to rethink how it defended itself, how it organized power, how it responded to threats that did not behave as expected. The Vikings did not simply challenge armies, they challenged assumptions. And in doing so, they reshaped the very structure of conflict. That is why their impact endures, not because of how many battles they fought, but because of how they changed the nature of fear. They showed that fear does not need to be constant to be effective. It only needs to be possible. It only needs to exist in the mind, ready to emerge at any moment, turning peace into something temporary, something uncertain. And that is the final realization. The Vikings did not just conquer territories, they conquered perception. They made an entire continent feel exposed, not through endless war, but through the understanding that war could arrive without warning, anywhere, at any time. And once a world learns that lesson, it never forgets it. Because from that point forward, every quiet morning carries a question. Not if something will happen, but when, and whether you will be ready when it does.